Okay, just up ahead of me through the trees just there is an intersection of two of the single most important features in the British landscape, certainly in my opinion. Now before I show you those features and where they interact with one another, let's give you some mapping context. Okay, have a look at this map. Now I could probably pick any map from across southern England to show you an example of these features. Look at these lines. Those lines look like a series of dots or score marks, all indicating a linear structure across the landscape, a man-made linear structure. Now they're often marked with Grimm's Ditch or Dyke, a couple of other names too, but here's the weird thing, they stretch from right down in Wiltshire all the way up to Hertfordshire and probably beyond. Now if that was one connected linear earthwork at one point, well, that'd be one of the biggest structures in the country. Okay, and so this is exactly what they look like. Now they do vary of course, but we do have quite a subsizable bank there built into the hillside. You can see the ridge of it just here, sort of 10 feet away from me, and you've got the ditch behind me just there. So you've got a bank and a ditch. Now the bank was always sort of one side of it, not much of a bank this side, it kind of just follows the rest of the contour of the land. These prop up everywhere. So what exactly was this for? Was it a boundary, a routeway, a defensive structure? And do they have things in common? Do they link in some way all across the south of Britain? What are these lines? Welcome to the story of Grimm's Ditch. So what exactly do we mean when we say Grimm's Ditch? Why are there so many of them marked up on all of the old maps? And will that sort of help us understand what they were for?
I'm Dr. Wendy Morrison and I'm the Heritage and Archaeology Manager for the Chilterns National Landscape. So my job is pretty much being a voice for archaeology and talking to people about archaeology and developing projects about the heritage and past of the Chiltern Hills.
The word ditch is likely from the Old English spelling of how you would say ditch, which would be D-I-C, but would be pronounced dyke or dyke. Now, we have these mentioned by the Anglo-Saxons a little over 1,000 years ago in their charters, often when describing land boundaries.
The grim part, or the devil's part, basically comes from grima, which is another word, sort of a shorthand for Woden or Odin. But of course that doesn't mean that that's what they were called by the people that dug them.
And when the Anglo-Saxons came here, they must have stood puzzled at these linear features stretching for miles in either direction and wondered what they'd for, perhaps not representing anything that they had come across before.
Scholars have sort of disagreed about whether the attribution to Grima or Odin has to do with the fact that people thought that the god had built these things, or whether people had built these things and dedicated them to the god. And in many ways it doesn't really matter, because this isn't what the people who actually did construct it would have called them.
And when you lived here and worked here maybe at the time, well then it's possible you wouldn't have had the ability to travel a great distance, and maybe you would have never seen the start or the end of one of these structures. It'd be very easy to attribute them to something otherworldly, a god, a devil, or grim. So here we are, Grimm's Ditch. Now, I've said to you that this is very typical for the construction of the Grimm's Ditch, the bank and the ditch. And whilst that is true in most cases, well, it's not completely true in all. You see, here we are now in one of the many examples, northwest Wiltshire. But here in southeast Oxfordshire, well, have a look at this. We have another Grimm's Ditch. I wouldn't call this one unique, but it certainly has a few features that are very different to the other Grimm's Ditches. Not least is this 3 miles straight line, which is really curious. Now we do have the similar feature of the bank and the ditch, but come and take a look at this section just here.
One of the things that's really interesting about the fact that there are so many of these Grimm's Ditches around the country is that, of course, they all carry a same or similar name, because people saw them and were like, oh, that must be one of Woden's dykes.
Just climb up the bank. Well, it's going to take some work because this is huge. This reminds me in some ways of Wandsdyke, sort of Saxon Mercia border. I'm standing here, I'm not quite at the top yet. You can see it's quite steep. Big ditch. That would have been a lot deeper because we've probably got about 1 metre of erosion's worth of soil and leafage and all sorts in there. this would have been a lot steeper. To organise something this vast with this precision without it taking a society of some description, it would have taken sort of huge numbers of people to build it and construct it. It's vast.
And it might be a mistake to assume that they are all the same sort of feature.
Now the OS map for this part of the country, and I've only got a very old copy, still works, so well, this shows us a really interesting feature in this landscape that we really do need to consider. Have a look at this. Right down here you have numerous east-west lines, and they're showing how they would split up the parishes. We have on one side, the west side, we have the Thames and probably the really fertile land right over maybe 3 or 4 miles to the east, where we have Monwell's Wood. Now this has been the higher land, perhaps a more arable land, so it really shows in this area how they split that up into lines, perhaps dividing up areas of really fertile to arable, all the different land uses within one parish. Of course, one of those lines is our Grimm's Ditch, so it's been used now as a parish border. But does this help us date this in any way? Well, the simple answer is no, but it's extremely rare to see parish boundaries split by a monumental earthwork like this, so we can probably safely say it was built before the 8th century. This is a huge question, almost as important as the date. Where exactly do we find Grimm's Ditch? And I don't just mean where are they on the map, but I guess I mean where are they in relation to local geography? Are there any correlations that could help us piece together this mystery? Well, it turns out there are. Okay, in order to understand these monuments better, I think it's probably a good idea if we map them. Now this won't be an easy task, but we'll start with Google Maps. If we can pinpoint all of the locations on the old OS maps, well then we could have a good chance of understanding these monuments a lot better and piecing this puzzle together of what they were for. This particular bit, as with all of them, is really beautiful. It feels like I'm walking along a lost abandoned railway on an embankment that sort of cuts through the landscape here. Can't see much of a ditch, but the bank is huge. So that's what I did. I scoured the maps to find every mention of Grimm's Ditch I could possibly find, plotted them all, and there we have it. Now that is certainly too many for me to visit in one film, but we can see Grimm's Ditch appear in so many places from West Wiltshire, East Wiltshire, Hampshire, Berkshire, Oxfordshire, Hertfordshire, Bedfordshire, and probably a lot more that I've missed on top of that. So if we consider that this is pre-Saxon, based on the boundaries that we see today which utilised Grimm's Ditch, and we certainly know it's not Roman, it's definitely not typical of any Roman feature we've seen before, well then that really puts into question any hypothesis that all of these Grimm's Ditches were built at the same time by the same people in one concerted effort. Pre-Roman society, Iron Age, we really didn't have that joined up thinking on such a large scale across the country. Well then we need to consider what all of these structures had in common. Well, they all had a bank like this, and they had a ditch. Now similarly, a lot of them are the same size, perhaps with the exception of this one, the Monwell monumental one. Well, there is one other feature that a lot of them share in common and really confuses the life out of me and many others. Have a look at this.
The Chilterns National Landscape is home to 9 designated chalk streams, and those chalk streams, although they look very small compared to a river like the Thames, the valleys that they actually are housed in are very large, and the catchments which feed those rivers also are very large. So what we're seeing, if we look at, for instance, the River Chess and the Hewenden stream, which feeds into the River Wye, those two catchments, if you actually look at the drainage of those catchments in the LiDAR, you can see that the Grimm's Ditches sort of cap the top of the Hewenden stream catchment and the top of the Chess catchment. So I think one of the biggest leaps in scholarship for thinking about these features has been, over the last 200 years, the shift from assuming that they are Anglo-Saxon because of the name, also because of the way that they link up with more recent boundaries. So it's very easy to think, oh yes, well this must be something like Offa's Dyke or Wands Dyke, because it matches up perfectly with the sorts of boundary lines, county boundaries, parishes boundaries, and that sort of thing.
Okay, so we want to go about working out how old Grimm's Ditch is. Right here, look at this classic example. Now, has anyone established a date of this before? The biggest issue with structures like this, they're not often at the centre of a community, whatever their purpose was.
Grimm's Ditches can be really frustrating to date because they run for a really long extent, and you're not opening up the whole extent, so you're looking at a tiny little sliver through, if you're lucky enough to excavate. And so you have to hope that somebody has dropped something or discarded something or intentionally deposited something in that little snapshot that you're looking at. And 9 times out of 10, 90 times out of 100, it doesn't happen.
But we can start to narrow things down a bit to help us in that little quest. Now, do you remember the feature that I told you about at the start of the video? The intersection of 2 really important features. Well, come and take a look at this in the hedge just through here. Now, whilst I try and find what I'm looking for, we can confirm that this is pre-900 AD because we have an Anglo-Saxon charter for Mongwell just back where we were earlier, and this is as far back as we know. This is the first written reference to this structure, Grim's Ditch. Okay, so this is feature number 1, and this is the Grim's Ditch, what we're talking about today. Now, just up ahead of me, I think somewhere here, it interacts with the Roman road, the lead road, which went sort of Winchester, Salisbury, up to the Mendips for lead. Now, if we can find that interaction, well, that will help us tell us which came first. This is one of many places I could have shown you an example of how Grim's Ditch and a Roman road co-interact, if that's the right phrase. So here we have Grim's Ditch. Now, whether it comes out on camera or not, but it's probably about 4 or 5 feet deep just there. And right here, the other side of this camera, just get underneath this branch, well, it just stops because this is the point where a Roman road cut right across Grim's Ditch just there, and the ditch is gone. Let's get on top of the Roman road. Here we are, and Grim's Ditch is no longer. We have slightly obtuse angle, but right here across in front of me now is where a Roman road interacted with the Grim's Ditch, and the Grim's Ditch is no longer. So what does that tell us? This, as in many cases, it tells us the Romans built straight through Grim's Ditch. Therefore, Grim's Ditch predates the Roman road. That's a great thing we can do about dating without even lifting a shovel.
On some of the Chilterns Grim's Ditches in excavations in the latter part of the 20th century, some scraps of pot were discovered, and in almost every case they are prehistoric, and they tend towards the late Bronze Age or into the early and middle Iron Age.
But can we pin this down even further? Late Bronze Age to early Iron Age could potentially give us 500 to 1,000 years. Well, it turns out we can from a potentially divisive topic.
The other thing that we can learn about them is through excavation. Now, the opportunity to excavate Grim's Ditch doesn't come along every single day, and sometimes it's developer driven. In one particular instance, with the construction of HS2, always controversial, and in some instances not welcome, but good archaeology has occurred in advance of HS2 going in, and we hope in the near future to hear that there has been some robust dating evidence from that as well. My prediction is it's going to turn out to be Iron Age.
Take a look at the LiDAR for the Chilterns, which really helps us to see the topography of the area in relation to Grim's Ditch. Okay, so to my untrained eye, well, this looks defensive. You see, you've got up there the bank, and here you've got the ditch, and then you're back to level that side. So this is by far the steeper side, and if we come up here, you get the idea that I feel like I could stand up here, drop down a hole, I could stand up here and defend against what was incoming from that direction. Now, here in the Chilterns, well, that's where we encounter a problem with that defensive notion. It's all well and good me now stood on top of this bank, facing that way, defending against what was incoming from here, but it doesn't really fit the geography because behind me, the area I would be defending, well, that goes downhill by quite a steep drop into the valley, into the Icknield Way. Surely if I was defending something, I'd be defending this plateau, this hill, and therefore this bank and the ditch are the wrong way round. That doesn't quite add up. And of course the other point is, it's not that big to be defensive. This isn't huge hill fort type construction. It's only 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters here, with the exception of Mongwell. This is very typical of Grim's Ditch, and it doesn't look like it's going to do much in the way of defend a territory. This has been considered by a few. It often travels just below a ridgeway skirting the landscape, but we do have far too many negatives for this to be taken seriously. Well, we have a significant bank on one side, nothing on the other, and of course a ditch here. Well, it often also circles large areas, almost like fencing them off in some ways, with immediate deviations. That isn't anything like a route we've seen before. Okay, so we know this was potentially Iron Age, maybe even early Iron Age. Now we know the Iron Age people were tribal people, and we know that they're very good at moving earth and building large structures of defensive type nature. We know that from the hill forts that we see hundreds of them around the country, maybe even thousands. Now, if we consider this to be a trade barrier, well, we know they could have built that, they have the capacity and the societal organisation, well then we need to potentially put it into context with the routes they were trying to mark as a trade barrier, potentially the Ridgeway and the Jurassic Way. The Ridgeway for certain looks littered with Grimm's ditches, so a number of barriers to travel along it could have worked, but it doesn't quite fit. Firstly, some of the Grimm's ditches run parallel to the Ridgeway, and often their semicircular nature really doesn't highlight how this could have worked. Okay, in this video I've tried to look at Grimm's Ditch as one. Now if not one group of people or one tribe, clearly not, well then one notion, one idea of building an earthwork perhaps as a boundary or linear structure in this time of early tribal beginnings. Is this how you border an estate or an area or a tribe or a frontier of some kind? Ideas like that travelled, and they didn't need to be consistent because Grimm's Ditch is far from consistent. This is potentially just a marker on the land. Just one of these structures, just one of these Grimm's Ditches is a monumental undertaking. The time, the planning, the vision to see beyond your line of vision at that time in the Iron Age. Well, maybe we underestimate how they lived and worked and what they saw as threats. This is huge, and it's just one structure.
One of the interpretations that's offered for Grimm's Ditches and these sorts of linear earthworks and this planning of the landscape is that we're looking at boundary markers and possibly tribal boundary markers. Now, the Iron Age tribal society gets a lot of ink spilt over it. So it's been posited, for instance, the Hertfordshire Grimm's Ditch are a border for the Catavaloni tribe. The only evidence we have for these tribes is in the very latest Iron Age. And it's very possible that these features are being built in the early Iron Age. And we throw the term Iron Age around quite handily, and we're very comfortable saying that, but what we're talking about is an 800 to 1,000 year chunk of time. And that would be very much like saying the sorts of systems of society and government that we have now are exactly the same as the ones we had at the Battle of Hastings. And of course we know that's completely different. So it's a huge chunk of time, and I think that's really important to keep in mind when we try to just interpret this as tribal boundaries. Instead, what I think might be happening, and I'm not the first to say this, is that these are markers in land use. They are boundaries to delineate the arable, the plough land on the lower elevations from the grazing on the upper elevations. I think these are boundary markers, but not in the sense that we think that they're boundary markers. It's marking the difference between arable and pastoral. So you're grazing up on the high ridge, and then, think about it, if you've got stock up there, yeah, this serves a really good barrier because of the way that the ditch and the bank work. But the other thing is that we just don't have enough robust evidence to stand firmly and say this is exactly what Grimm's Ditch is for. And even if we did for this segment here that I'm stood in front of, it might not apply to Munchwell's Grimm's Ditch, to the Grimm's Ditches in Wiltshire and in Hampshire and in the Devil's Dykes in East Anglia. One of the great things about archaeology is that archaeology tells a story of people who couldn't tell that story for themselves. And what that means is our job as archaeologists is to tell an interesting story but based on fact. And any prehistorian who tries to tell you that they know exactly what happened in the past is probably trying to sell you something. But on that note, Paul said it was all right if I did try to sell you something. I've written a book on Grimm's Ditch, Facts and Fairy Tales. Again, this is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it's aimed at 12 to 16-year-olds, but it's a cracking good read for everybody. And basically it looks at the Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire Grimm's Ditches, the facts and fairy tales around them, and it's an introduction to archaeology. Basically, what evidence do we have?
Okay, so I had filmed a very different ending to this one previously because I didn't realise what Wendy was going to say, and the theory or the hypothesis that Wendy came out with has turned all this on its head for me, and I absolutely love it. What do you think the use of the Grimsdyke was for? Do you agree with Wendy, or have you got another theory? Get typing in the comments below. And of course, a big thanks to Wendy for her time today. You can check out all of her links in the description below. If you like videos about ditches in the landscape, well, you're going to love the Wansdyke, or Wansdyke, and that link can be found here or here, perhaps. Thanks for watching. We'll see you this time next week.